Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Vashon Center for the Arts. I recognize a whole lot of faces out here. I'm Bruce Morser. I'm on the board here at the Art Center. Very happy to be so. And this is a great crowd. Isn't it Vashon for something about owls to bring out this kind of a crowd? Just great stuff. Let me take a moment here. I want to thank our sponsors this afternoon. It's Ida Gay and Tom Nicolino, old friends, and Ellen Kritzman. And I think most of you know that we count on sponsorships for programs like this. Like all art centers, selling tickets gets you about half the way there, and then you have to have creative ways to get the other half of the way, and people have often come up. And those three people have come forward and helped us many, many, many times. Our thanks is endless for them. So if that would be of interest to you as a way of helping the arts organization, please step forward. And you can speak to me, you can speak to Allison, anybody, and we will certainly line you up and show you an entire list of people you could potentially sponsor. A quick word about upcoming events. First, I think we've all seen at this point the Birds Take Flight exhibition at the Koch Gallery right out here in our lobby. And at the end of this month, on Sunday, January 26th at 2 p.m., Adria McGrath, who is from the Vashon Bird Alliance, who also does a whole lot of things around here at the Art Center, is going to give a talk. And she's going to literally take groups of people, the group of people, the horde of people, through the art gallery and talk to them about specific pieces of art and how it reflects on the bird's behavior or their species or those sorts of things, or environmental roles. And that whole thing at 2 p.m. will be free. The second one I wanted to mention is on February 2nd at 2 p.m. You begin to realize that 2 p.m. is the time around here where people start talking. At 2 p.m., Danny Miller, in collaboration with the Vashon Nature Center, will be giving a talk on DNA and the secret history of mushrooms. And it seems like over the last couple decades, we've learned that mushrooms are everywhere. They're creeping through, they're just everywhere. And Danny apparently has a great deal to talk about how that is, why that is. And I think that'll be fascinating. And then the third one I want to mention is back to our beloved Rebecca Albiani on March 30th at 2 p.m. We'll be talking about Frida Kahlo. And that will be part of the Women's History Month series of events. So that's an appropriate thing to have here. Okay, so for this afternoon, it's really hard to resist puns. I noticed in all the promotions around this owls thing, they were littered with all kinds of puns. I'm not even going to go there. I really look forward to all of Rebecca's talks, but this one seemed really interesting to me. I think because it's not about like a single artist or an artistic movement or even a technique, but about, ostensibly a narrow subject that has really a provocatively broad styles and implications. And that's just a wonderful angle. So let's give Rebecca, our beloved art historian, Rebecca Albiani, a big welcome, please.
The winter owl banked just in time to pass and save herself from breaking window glass. And her wings straining, suddenly a spread caught color from the last of evening red in a display of underdown and quill to glassed-in children at the windowsill. Robert Frost's 1962 poem, Questioning Faces, captures the wonder of a close encounter with the powerful and silent wing beats of a snowy owl, something that most of us city dwellers experience only in the nature photography of artists like Paul Bannock or art wolf. Here, Bannock has captured this owl just as it wheels and yet still faces us. It almost gives us that experience of Frost's children at the window panes, gazing in awe and excitement at an owl. And an owl is not an everyday sight because they tend to be nocturnal, or at least crepuscular, like the snowy owl. And they are not city dwellers like the crows that I've spoken about here before. And yet they are so distinctive in their look as to have become iconic. And this Vashon lithograph of an owl from 1968 is in many ways not all that different from this cave engraving that is 35 plus thousand years old on the right. It is from the Chauvet cave in the Ardèche region of France. And it's on that sort of outcropping of rock that one sees only as one is leaving the cave and re-emerging into the light, into the normal world. But the artist has scratched this owl into the rock, and it's a little hard to see. Of course, it's a little old, so it's worn away a bit, but this is the face of the owl. That's the nose and the eyes. But this is the rear of the owl. So the artist has captured an owl's uncanny ability to turn its head 180 degrees, even 35,000 years ago. And I think that is so extraordinary. There are owls, about 250 species of them, living on every continent except for Antarctica. And scientists divide them into roughly two families: the true owls with their round faces and often their ear tufts, like these little screech owls from Audubon's Birds of America, and the barn owls with their heart-shaped faces, and both have been of tremendous interest to artists over the last 35,000 years of history. Now, there are a lot of owls in art, so if I don't get to your favorite, I apologize. I couldn't capture them all. But I wanted to focus on some interesting examples, and one of the fascinating manifestations of owls in art that I found was a series of ritual vessels from the Shang dynasty. So this is from roughly 12th or 13th BCE century China. And these are bronzes that are, they're made for ancestor rituals honoring the dead. And in general, there aren't a lot of owls in later Chinese art because owls were considered unlucky, because owls were associated with death. But in this ritual context, honoring the already dead, owls seemed like the perfect messenger. And so these extraordinary, at times quite naturalistic owl wine jugs were created. The head comes off, and you can pour the wine. This is a somewhat less naturalistic one, although still recognizable as an owl, but the decor of this one incorporates other creatures associated with the afterlife. So these wings, these edges of the wings, those are actually snakes. The heads can be found on the back, and then this chest is a cicada motif, but it also has horns. It's a very complex object. Also from the Shang dynasty, but a different shaped vessel, is this bronze, also a wine vessel, but a little broader and squatter, and it's two owls. So they are each facing out. You can use their spouts to lift the lid off, or their beaks to lift the lid off. And then these are their chests and their wings meet here on the sides. So the owl was a perfect motif for these very elaborate, elite objects to honor the deceased. The ancient Egyptians honored owls in their very alphabet. So hieroglyphs include an owl symbol, which had the sound of M. And you can find it immediately, right? Looking at these hieroglyphics, you can see, oh, that's a bird, but not an owl. That's a bird. That's a waterfowl. There is the owl. And it is probably the most beautiful system of writing ever invented, but because owl is basically M, the owl appears quite frequently. So this is in the mortuary temple of the female pharaoh Hatshepsut. And so this is art of the highest quality for the memorial rites of a pharaoh. And we see the owl, and how it is always portrayed in Egyptian art is body from the side, legs from the side, but head in full face. And that full-faced head is the subject of this Egyptian sculptor. This is a kind of object that scholars are not entirely certain what function it served. So these are sometimes called sculptor's models, but there are maybe too many of them to have been such a thing. So this is a fairly high relief in limestone. You can see how the beak is almost in complete, it's almost carved completely around. It does connect at the tip. But now we think that these objects were votive objects, that they would have been left in a temple. These gorgeously carved objects. This one's very late. It is from the period probably in which the Greeks ruled Egypt, and yet the quality of the carving and the look is very similar. Now the Greeks too included owls in their art, like this charming, tiny 2-inch high perfume flask, or aribolos, that is Corinthian. In the 7th century, Corinth was the major artistic center. It was at a crossroads between East and West, and so there are Egyptian influences, there are Phoenician and Near Eastern influences, but very often animal motifs appear in Corinthian art. But the owl is particularly appropriate for the Greeks, and particularly for the Athenians, for the owl was the animal associated with the goddess Athena. And here, Athena is seen on a lekithos, which is a wine flask, with a little owl, which I always thought was a little owl, but now I know it is a little owl. That is actually the species name. We see it there at the right, and its species name is Athene noctua. So it is this association with Athena has gotten into the scientific name of this owl. As you can see, it's not very big, but it did grace the coinage of the Athenians from about 500 BCE for the next couple of hundred years at least. So we see Athena's profile on one side and her owl and her olive branch on the other side, the olive being the great gift she gave to the Athenians. And within legends of battles and of Athenian life, owls appear regularly as omens, as portents. For instance, when the Athenians were battling the Persians at Marathon, an owl circled over the troops in daylight, and that was a sign that they would achieve victory. And there are a lot of these adorable Athenian skyphoses, which is a kind of a wine vessel as well. And these come in two kinds, one in which both of the handles are vertical, but this is type B, in which one handle is vertical and the other is horizontal. And it has been argued that the orientation of the handles themselves suggest the shape of an owl. I'm not quite sure if I buy that, but there are hundreds of these, and they are all charming, and they all feature an owl and the olive branch. So Athenian ceramics are rife with owls. Another great ceramic culture that seems to have adored the owl is the Moche culture from Peru, from the early centuries of the Common Era. So this is a stirrup spout bottle. You can sort of see the stirrup spout coming out of the back, also sometimes called a handle spout. And it's in a, recognizable shape of a barn owl. We see the heart-shaped face. It is stylized, but it is naturalistic enough that we recognize it immediately. Now, we don't know why the Moche were so interested in owls, if they just liked the way that they looked, or if they had some greater significance. Any sort of legends attached to these peoples have long since been lost to the mists of time. But one possibility is that they knew that the owls helped as exterminators. That the Moche grew grain and that owls were active eaters of mice and other rodents and pests, what the Moche would have considered agricultural pests. So here we see that relationship immortalized on this handle spout bottle that is in the shape of an owl eating a mouse. These are not everyday ceramics. This would have been a more elite production, but the really elite Moche owl objects are metal. So the Moche artists were skilled with metallurgy, and this is a really extraordinary disc. They call it a shield, but it's only 11 inches in diameter. It's not big enough to defend oneself in battle, and it's also too fragile. So they think it might have been a sort of model shield for a funerary context. So this includes both silvered and gilded copper. The background was silvered copper. The owl itself was gilded copper and is made out of 5 conjoined pieces, some of which attach to the main disc with tabs that go through on the back, but the wings attach only to the body. So that were this used in display of some sort, the wings would have fluttered, and the head is attached on a metal rod, so it could have swiveled. So this was an object for royalty, possibly for a funerary context, possibly for some sort of ceremonial context. I hope lots of people got to lay eyes on it because it was spectacular. But this association of the owl with death does mean that often these objects are from a funerary context, and this particular gold bell was found in the sacred cenote at Chichen Itza. So it was made in Costa Rica or Panama, but it was traded with the Maya of the Yucatan Peninsula, and it was sacrificed, it was offered, this beautiful, valuable gold object was offered to the gods in that holy well, that sacred cenote. In Western medieval art, owls are not necessarily the wise creatures of Athena. Medieval art seems to have suppressed that particular interpretation of the owl in favor of seeing the owl as either a threatening nocturnal creature or even a figure of fun. So there are a lot of fables in which the owl is egotistical but not actually as intelligent as it thinks itself. And here in the margins of the Lattrell Psalter, it's one of the glories of English manuscript illumination, we find a parody of a knight or perhaps a lady hawking or hunting with a hawk or a falcon, which was an aristocratic pursuit, on horseback. This is a monkey on goat back with an owl instead of a falcon. So this is a complete parody. But there is a darker side of the symbolism of owls in medieval art, particularly in British art. And that is that the owl was seen as someone who rejects the sun and lives in darkness. And for the medieval Christian mind, that equated owls with Jews who had rejected Christianity. And so in some English bestiaries of the early medieval period, this is from the 13th century, owls are given rather anthropomorphized faces that resemble stereotypical imaginings of Jews and are mobbed or pecked at by daylight birds who represent Christians. This is another example of this same motif, even though by this time the Jews had been expelled from England, and yet they are still painting and sculpting this theme of the blind owl mobbed by daylight birds. So this is a misericord, which is a carving on the bottom of a seat in a choir stall. And not even much of a seat. Really, the monks couldn't really sit on it. They could just sort of lean on it to take a little weight off of their feet during an eternal sort of mass. But you can see here that you can kind of see the edge of the choir stall and the curved shape of the bench. So this would pull down, and you wouldn't, if someone were sitting on it, you wouldn't see it, but when the choir stalls are empty, the misericords are up, and the beautiful carving is seen. Now this took on an even more pernicious meaning after the Black Plague, the bubonic plague. Because what is the word for owl in Latin? Bubo. And so this is in the margins of a medical text by John of Ardern, and the bubo, he's talking about the bubonic plague, so this is sort of a mnemonic, but it is also one of those hooked-nosed owls that was associated in the English imagination with Judaism. And the plague was, in certain places, blamed on the Jewish population. And that, in fact, led to massacres of the Jewish population because the ignorant Christians believed that they were responsible for this, for bringing this mass death and destruction. Now, owls appear in the work of Hieronymus Bosch quite frequently. And this might look like that same theme of the owl being harassed by birds of the daylight, of the daytime. So we see the owl in the tree, the birds, and the owl looks put upon. And the birds are noisy. But this is Hieronymus Bosch, so it's weirder than that. Because the fields have eyes, and the forests have ears. The trees have ears. And that was a saying in Dutch that meant that you always have to be careful. You can never be certain of not being overheard. Even if you're out in the forest, the trees have ears. So he's combining the owl and the chattering with this theme of being overheard. And it's very interesting. Bosch, though, seems to have had a fondness for owls because they appear multiple times in his work, although it's a little hard to interpret them. So this is Bosch's famous Garden of Earthly Delights, this triptych of paradise, we're not quite sure what, and hell. So here God is introducing Eve to Adam, and this is the time before. There are a lot of interpretations for the central panel, which is also the largest and most fabulous panel, that this is what life would have looked like had the fall never occurred, being one of those interpretations. But if we look at this paradise, you'll see that there is a fountain fountain of life here at the center. And in the center of that fountain is an owl, sort of there in the dark while the daytime birds flutter around. There are two more owls in the center panel at the extreme left and extreme right sides. So this is one. And this owl, it just looks puzzled. But it sits atop a sort of egg-like, flower-like enclosure that unites two naked people who are dancing with enormous cherries in their hands. And then over here on the left, we find a man embracing a very dark-eyed owl. There's this sort of pansexuality expressed in that central panel, but exactly what Bosch, is intending. And of course, there is an association in many European languages between bird and the male member, but exactly what Bosch is suggesting, we are just never going to be sure. And there is an owl in the haywain. And here I think it's a little clearer what this owl means, and you would struggle to find it. But this is another triptych with the expulsion of, so again, the paradise on the left, Eve being created, the snake, the expulsion of Adam and Eve, and then on the right, another hell panel, but in the center, definitely our world, with work, with play, with the 7 deadly sins all going on. So there's all sorts of corruption and looking away from Jesus, who is up here in the clouds, but except for this angel, Jesus is being roundly ignored. The owl is right here. So just to go back, the owl is right there. And you can see the angel looks up to Jesus, but these people are not thinking about their immortal souls. And the owl there on the branch at, in broad day, I think suggests that kind of blindness. The day blind owl. Everyone in this panel is the day blind owl who is ignoring their salvation and thinking about their own pleasure. But in one Bosch drawing, the owls seem simply to be owls. And this is one of the few Bosch drawings that's not connected with a panel painting, with another composition, but we see a vigilant, maybe father owl, a protective mother owl, and a baby owl in the nest. Owls can rarely be bothered to build nests. They either borrow other creatures' nests or nest in the cavities in trees and the like. So this is a rather naturalistic depiction of owls, which would become a standard part of art referring to the natural world from the Renaissance forward. So we have artists who are almost naturalists, like Da Vinci and Dürer, who are looking at the natural world and depicting it as faithfully as they can. This is Dürer's The Little Owl, who bears some resemblance to the owl being embraced in Bosch, but philosophically, no resemblance whatsoever. This is just an owl. The greatest Renaissance sculptor, Michelangelo, depicts exactly one owl in his oeuvre, It's in the depiction of Night, the tomb of Giuliano de' Medici in the sacristy of San Lorenzo in Florence. Night reclines across the top of the sarcophagus. At her foot are a bundle of poppies, which are so half-assed. Michelangelo could not care less about poppies. But the interesting thing is that the owl is quite good. Michelangelo is all about the human figure, and really all about the male nude. And if he has to do a landscape, it's just the barest suggestion. If he has to do poppies, it's just barely poppies. And yet this owl makes me think that he knew some fragment of a Roman copy of a Greek sculpture of an owl, part of an Athena monument or something, but only the classical past would get him this excited about sculpting a bird. But the owl continues to be associated not so much with Athena in the Renaissance and Baroque periods as with folly, with the folly of being nocturnal, of only being around at nighttime. Malababa is the town crazy woman, the town drunk. The owl is not on her shoulders to make her into a kind of goddess of wisdom. It is there to emphasize her folly. And similarly, the owls in Tiepolo's fabulous etchings are all about being nocturnal creatures, associated with darkness and with death. And it is as such that Francisco Goya, who was a tremendous admirer of Tiepolo, includes owls in his caprichos, his 80 etchings about the caprices, the follies of his era. Goya lived during the Enlightenment, a time when the light of reason should have shone on humanity. But instead, Goya knew how easily that light could slip. So in his famous "The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters," we find his Enlightenment intellectual fast asleep at his desk and pursued by nightmare images of owls and bats, both of whom were associated with witchcraft, with evil, with darkness, and with folly. And Goya uses an enormous, bespectacled owl in his plate 75 from the Caprichos, "Can No One Untie Us?" This is about the impossibility of divorce in Catholic Spain, and this couple is tied together forever. And the owl suggests the folly of such an arrangement, which, as we see, is even harder on the women. She has both of her legs bound together, whereas the man has one leg free, and a whole lot more freedom of movement. Now, because owls were associated with death, they don't often appear in Chinese and Japanese art. However, they are so striking that some artists could not resist depicting them. Artists like Soga Nichokuan, whose owl on a pine branch we see at left, this beautiful ink painting, just shades of gray, and Hiroshige's full-color woodblock print of an owl on a pine branch. And I wonder if Hiroshige knew Soga or some other work that had been inspired by this one. But Hiroshige's owl is asleep. And we see that marvelous full moon on the left, which is not painted at all. It's simply the reserved color of the background. And similarly, the crescent moon on the right, which is the color of the paper, the white of the paper. And sometimes netsuke were carved in owl forms. This one I think is so adorable because it's not just an owl, but also two owlets. Can you find the owlets? There's one there and one there. They're just peeking out. It's so adorable. But netsuke were these utilitarian objects that attached one's hanging things to one's kimono in lieu of pockets, but they turned into an art form of miniature ivory carving at a very high level. In the 19th century, depictions of owls tend more towards the naturalistic. We have the actual naturalists like Audubon publishing full-color, very expensive editions of books of birds, including powerful evocations of owls, like this great cinerus owl from Audubon, or Bruno Liljefor's, the great Swedish wildlife painter, here painting an eagle owl in a style that has been influenced by Impressionism. So we get some of the brushiness, the lightness of touch that adds to the appearance of fluff, and yet the eyes are treated in a much more academic fashion. It's a startling and marvelous image. Owls have always occurred in legend and fairy tale and children's literature, as indeed they do in the early 20th century in the tale of Squirrel Nutkin, who, with his fellow squirrels, goes to gather nuts on the island that is ruled by old Mr. Brown. And all of the squirrels are very deferential to Mr. Brown, all except for Squirrel Nutkin. And this is Potter's original watercolor. Here, Squirrel Nutkin is tickling old Mr. Brown with a nettle. And Nutkin barely gets out of this encounter alive. He does sacrifice his tail to old Mr. Brown. But Potter, before she was a children's book designer, was a naturalist, was someone who had her own menagerie of creatures and studied bats and birds and creatures of all type very, very intensely. The surrealists were enamored of owls. So Max Ernst, when he was married to Peggy Guggenheim, but perhaps still obsessed with his lost love, Leonora Carrington, painted this, the Attirement of the Bride, a work he had actually started the studies for before he had met Peggy and while he was still involved with Carrington. And you can see that he gives his bride this owl headdress. and this long robe, and that scholars think symbolizes Carrington, and this more heron-like bird with the legs, but with the very phallic spear there, symbolizes Ernst himself. Carrington would also make owl images. This is her undated drawing of an owl in a long cloak and having more than the owl's usual allotted number of claws to grip that orb. And Carrington ended up leaving Europe entirely and settling in Mexico City, where one of her close friends was Remedios Varo, a Spanish-born surrealist who also fled World War II and settled in Mexico City. And this is her most famous painting, The Creation of the Birds, which features an owl-headed woman as the creator, who is painting birds and then animating them with a kind of magical prism. Her paints come from an alchemical object. It's a marvelous image, but the owl is there at the heart of it. The owl with its wisdom, but also its association with alchemy and with darkness. Another surrealist, Joseph Cornell, is most famous for his boxes. Cornell made these sort of shallow stage settings in which he placed sometimes fairy tale scenes, sometimes there's an actual taxidermied parrot in one that's titled something about Carmen Miranda, but he did a number of boxes with owls. And these are not taxidermied, but rather the owls are flat. The owls are cut out paper that were found objects for him, that they were part of advertising or something that he cut out and he mounted onto wood, and then he created environments for. He called this one Owl, a Habitat with Secrets. And he would go out into the woods and collect stuff like bark, like shelf lichen, and sometimes he would grind it up and sort of spread it on other things, but here he leaves them fairly intact and places his flat owl in this three-dimensional, very real environment. So it's meant to make us wonder what is real and what is not. And at the end of Cornell's life, he did several drawings that he titled, "They Say the Owl is a Baker's Daughter," which is a line from Hamlet. It's something Ophelia says. It refers to a legend in which a baker's daughter refused a crust of bread to a starving Jesus, who then turned her into an owl. It's not in the Bible, but Cornell was using this sort of Rorschach technique, where he would lay down ink and fold his paper and then unfold it and see what he had and then manipulate the ink and continue to play with it and collage on top of it and so forth. But I think it's so interesting that in this one, the manipulation seems to be both the owl and Ophelia, and a beautiful woman. Our local bird artist, Morris Graves, has depicted owls frequently. He did so throughout his career, and this is a fairly early work. he called Owl of the Inner Eye. So it is not an illustration of an owl. This is a sacred spiritual creature whose own eyes are not symmetrical, a creature that is associated with a winding snake here that winds through its body, another of these underworld creatures. But this was a very difficult time for Graves. He was a conscientious objector in World War II. He was imprisoned. He kept his sanity by imagining the freedom of birds and how that linked to the freedom of one's inner soul, even when one's skeleton and physical parts are imprisoned. This is a later work, a Sumi ink owl from 1957 by Graves, but it too seems to have a somewhat autobiographical aspect if we look at the face of this creature. Now, Picasso had an owl as a pet. It was an owl who had an injured claw, and so had to be rehabilitated, and was given to Picasso in 1946. And Picasso would paint this, so you see the owl, and immediately behind Picasso, and it was his friend Michel Sima who gave him the owl, we see this painting of the owl, whom Picasso's companion at the time, Françoise Gillot, describes in her book, Life with Picasso. She describes this owl as bad-tempered, as bitey, as angry, and in fact the bronze at right is called the angry owl. But Picasso would paint this owl and other owls. He would sculpt it in terracotta. He would have it cast in bronze. So in every medium, in his late etchings, in his linoleum prints, Picasso made owls. And this one from 1957, with its colors of terracotta and black, and its heraldic owl, almost brings us full circle back to those ancient Greek ceramics, where the owl is the owl of Athena. Picasso, of course, was always a very classically inspired artist, even when he was being a cubist. Françoise Gillot herself would depict owls on several occasions. This is her 1969 lithograph, The Goddess and the Owl. So we might imagine that this depicts Athena and her little owl. But I think there's another subtext to this as well, because by this time she was free of Picasso. She was the one companion who left Picasso rather than the other way around. And yet, the owl was given to Picasso while they were a couple. And it was before she had children. And Picasso once famously said that women to him were either goddesses or doormats. And that they generally transferred from the former to the latter at the point where they had children. And so I wonder if, in addition to a depiction of Athena, this is also a recollection of a time when she was Picasso's goddess. Miraut's owls, if they are owls at all, are very suggestive. This is in Miraut's typical late style with the heavy black outlines and the primary colors. He calls this one Surrealist Woman and Bird, and yet the two things, maybe buttocks and beak, seem to merge into the shape of an owl. And his sculpture personnage has also been considered an owl form. Now, the most surprising depiction of an owl that I found was this one. When I thought about 20th century artists who might have made whimsical depictions of owls, the modernist architect Le Corbusier did not come to mind, and yet this is from a book that he published, a series of lithographs that he called The Poem of the Right Angle. And even with these right angles and these human forms, we find the owl. And it's an owl that looks like it could have been scratched on a cave wall or painted on an amphora in classical Athens. Now, a couple of artists are almost synonymous with owls. They have depicted owls so frequently that it has become their signature image. And one of these is the Inuit artist, Kinojuak Ashevak. This is her enchanted owl from 1960. This one was so immediately popular that it would eventually become a postage stamp and kind of a symbol of Canada. And this is her festive owl from a decade later. Inuit artists have painted and carved owls. They are much more in contact with their local owls than we are down here out of the Arctic Circle. But another artist who is very closely associated with owls is the Japanese woodblock print artist Iwao Akiyama, who throughout the late 20th and early 21st century made legions of charming owls, familial owls, downcast owls, and the like. And there is something about that iconic form of an owl that it made its way into mid-century modern decoration. There are owl clocks. There are 1,000,002 owls on Etsy. But it's something that we can empathize with. And sometimes artists seem to use owls as self-portraits. So this is Jim Dine's blind owl. Jim Dine, around 2000, added the owl to his hearts and his bathrobes and his Venuses as one of his motifs. But this one is wrenching. He calls it blind owl. We don't see that it has eyes at all, which may mean that he's working from a specimen. But he paints it over a screen print of a room that looks like an artist's studio. And I don't know if Dine himself was losing his eyesight, but that is a fear of all artists. But it creates this very touching, slightly jarring juxtaposition of the very gestural oil paint of the owl and the photographic screen print of the interior that gives it a really autobiographical feeling. Another artist who has used owls in an autobiographical way is Maria Magdalena Campos Pons. She's a Cuban-born artist, an Afro-Cuban artist, who works frequently with this very large-scale Polaroid camera. making 2-foot-high color Polaroid images. But this is from a series she called Nesting. And as an immigrant artist, the idea of home is a very important one to her. And she certainly knows that owls often borrow their nests or use homes that are already there, that they don't create their homes. And she feels like she herself is in a borrowed nest in this country. I think she now is teaching in Nashville, if I'm not mistaken. But some artists have their owls querying us. This is a work from a series. This is one of a series of 66 paintings that Natalie Nyblack created a couple of years ago that I saw last year in an exhibit at the Museum of Northwest Art in La Conner. And each of these species is a Northwest bird species that probably will disappear if the climate warms by 3 degrees. And so the exhibition included not just these confrontational paintings like the northern saw-whet owl, but also birdsong. With each one, you could press a button and hear the call of that owl, because she wants us to be aware of what we are potentially losing. These majestic, intelligent creatures that have symbolized both reason and unreason, both intelligence and darkness for humanity for so long, that have fascinated humanity for so long. And so Nyblack challenges all of us to do our best to make sure that these species continue to exist on our planet. As she said, quote, ultimately, if we save the birds, we save all of nature and ourselves. Thank you. So are there questions or images you'd like a second look at? I cannot see you yet. Okay, see you. That one? The next one? Wait, this one? This one? That one? That there's a man standing behind the owl? Well, that would add to the impression. If there is a man standing behind the owl, and I'm not entirely certain I see it, but if you see a man standing behind the owl, no, if someone sees it, that's a reasonable way to interpret it. And that adds to that idea that this owl is not just an owl. This owl is also the artist himself, Jim Dine, yeah. So, okay, so yes? Oh, the owl as an omen of impending death. That is definitely a literary trope. It goes back at least to classical antiquity, but given the association, for instance, of owls with ancient Chinese, death rituals, I think it probably goes back a lot longer than that. And so yes, owls, for instance, were said to have presaged the death of Julius Caesar. There is a line in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar about, I can't remember exactly how it goes, but about that owl hooting in daylight that foretold Caesar's death. It's not often, the idea that these creatures have that sort of dark power is implicit in some of their representations. There's a vanitas, a memento mori painting, but it's anonymous and I couldn't get a good slide of it. But think dark Dutch still life with an owl atop a skull and a guttering candle. That maybe alludes to that ability of the owl to know if someone is about to die, but it's a little hard to represent the narrative of the owl hooting and then the death occurring. So it's not something that is frequently depicted in art, although that sort of malevolence is implicit in some images of owls. Okay.
Rebecca, I was wondering, this isn't so much a question, but a reflection. When I look at the owls, usually what stands out to me are the eyes. But they're not eyes like a doggy eye or a horse eye. They're eyes like a still eye that doesn't reflect what's happening. And it's kind of like a litmus test or something like that. You look at the eye, you don't know what the beast is thinking. But the eyes are so dominant. And I was wondering if that might lead to how we think about the owl. Because it's like it's looking at us, but it's not telling us what it's thinking.
So was everyone able to hear that? So yes, that the eyes of owls are very, very dominant and yet mysterious to us as humans. We cannot possibly know what an owl is thinking. And owl eyes are unusually large. That is why they have their fabulous night vision. But for that privilege, they had to evolutionarily give up some abilities. So owl eyes don't turn in their sockets. Owls can't glance to the left without turning their heads, which allowed them to have bigger eyes, but you evolutionarily, you win some things and you lose others. And so owls do have really big, really staring eyes. And that, I think, is something that fascinates humans about them. And there's also something a little feline and even a little human about those eyes. And in many, many of these owl images, from whatever period of prehistory or recent history, there's this feeling that the owl is being somehow anthropomorphized. That is a thinking being like we are, and parallels are being drawn. You don't have to look at the Ernst very long. Yes.
A lot of what I think of when I think of an owl is wisdom and the depiction of an owl as being very wise. But I'm not seeing that theme so much in anything that you've seen.
So there is wisdom. The association with Athena is an association with wisdom. The association with alchemy. Here, the very creator herself has an owl head. I think that's an incredible association with wisdom. And that, for us, that's what we think of. Why aren't we like this, this wise old owl? And Mr. Brown is a wise owl. He's the wise elder, and Squirrel Nutkin is this obnoxious teenager. But what I did want to emphasize is that is not the only association. It's our association when we think of owls. We think of wisdom. But there was, in the medieval period, a very strong counter-association with owls as devils, as nocturnal creatures, and so not trustworthy. They didn't do their business in daylight, but also not wise, because why skulk around at night when there's sunlight? And that's the association with anti-Semitism. That's Goya's association with all of the ills of the prejudices and superstitions of his society being represented with owls and bats. So that is also part of how owls have been represented over the centuries. So, other questions? Well, I will be back in March talking about Frida Kahlo. So I hope you will join me there. And thank you so much. And it looks like what I need to do to fill this room is talk about birds. So I'll see how to do that in the future.